everyone, and welcome to our speaker program tonight. I'm Linda Goff, co-president of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, and we are delighted to have you with us this evening to hear about the nooks and crannies of New York with our guest speaker, Justin Ferate, whom I will introduce in just a moment. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. If you'd be kind enough to remain muted through the presentation, that helps eliminate any possible background noise, etc. And then Justin's talk will be about 1 hour, and we'll have about a 15-20 minute period of questions and answers or comments in the chat box, which we will monitor and facilitate. So it's my pleasure to introduce Justin, whom I've known for several years now. He defected from Santa Fe, I might add, and moved back to New York about a year or so ago. But Justin is an urban historian, and I often refer to him as my Renaissance man, because if there's something you want to know about almost everything, including the art world, he's the person to go to. He has been voted on numerous occasions of the best tour guide in New York and received several commendations from former governors of New York. He's written a variety of articles about the art world itself. And because he's been a member of the Jewish Historical Society for a number of years and kindly gives one talk a year for us, he's developed quite a fan following, and many of us are groupies. So without any further comments or ado from me, let me turn it over to Justin. Justin?
I'm here, thank you. I'm going to turn on the screen. Okay, okay, welcome. I apologize for that. My name is Justin Ferate, and I live in the town of Riverdale-on-Hudson, which for those who are familiar with New York, you know where that is. It's part of the Bronx, and it's just a little bit north of Manhattan, and we're right on the edge of the Hudson River. So some practical things. If for some reason the volume is not high enough, please put that in your chat box, and Naomi will let me know that I need to speak up a little louder or whatever. So we're going to be doing a little visit to New York City and nooks and crannies of New York. And for those who remember me, that's what I look like. For those who don't remember me, that's what I look like. So we're going to be visiting different aspects of New York to give you a sense of some of the things that make New York such a magical place. Now, I figured let's begin at the beginning. So here is the 0 mile point of the city of New York. And from the bottom step of City Hall, that's 0 mile point. And historically, all maps of the New York City radius would radiate from that very point. The City Hall is still considered to be one of the most beautiful buildings ever built in the United States. It's from 1811, and it marked the post road taking you up to the capital of New York State, Albany. So the two capitals of New York were historically New York City, which was the first capital, and then Albany, which would be the second capital. And this is one of the actual post road markers along the Albany Post Road, which is another word for Broadway. And the stone around it was actually put in by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who wanted to preserve the ancient Dutch heritage of New York City and New York State. So there are lots of things that he would make it a point. This is sort of a personal thing for him. And in the center of the City Hall Park that would be restored, this was originally the commons for the city of New York. This is where people would take their animals out to graze when New York City was south of where the City Hall is. I always point out that when City Hall was built in 1811, the front was built with Westchester marble and the back side was built with cheap New Jersey brownstone, because quite frankly, in the wisdom of the city fathers, they figured no one of any consequence would ever live north of City Hall. And I think time has probably proven them to be correct. That's a joke. That's a joke. Anyway, here is one of the monuments there right near City Hall. This is one of the original Liberty poles. You can see this wonderful marker here stating Liberty Hill, Liberty. And this is where the Liberty poles would be placed specifically to goad the British, because the King of England owned every pine tree in what would become the United States. It was the personal property of the King of England. And the reason is because pine trees grow tall and straight and make perfect masts for sailing ships. And so every pine tree was the official property of the king. Don't you mess with it. So that's why they became the Liberty poles. And it was a sign of protest to use, to take the Liberty poles and to make them public monuments. New York City is strongly connected with the American Revolution. And here is where the Sons of Liberty would meet in this red brick, yellow brick building, which actually used to be suspended over the East River. The river was filled in more and more and more. And if I took you to the building, you'd say, you're kidding me. This was never over the river. This is Francis Tavern. Samuel Francis was from Africa by way of Barbados, and he would become the major. It frankly was a bar and a restaurant and a sleeping place. And Francis Tavern would be where the Sons of Liberty would meet. In fact, the first sign of the attack of the British was to shoot a cannon that would go through the roof of this building. They figured we'll just get right to the heart of things. So it was in this building that when George Washington said farewell to his officers, he would meet at Francis Tavern's Long Hall. All during the American Revolution, Samuel Francis was the assistant to George Washington. So there's a long, long, important history there. Here, remember, the revolution wasn't necessarily going to definitely happen. And there was an attempt on Staten Island to correct the problems. It was called Conference House because there was a conference on September 11th, 1776. And at that conference were Colonel Billop, who owned the house, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge, who would meet with, and this is going to confuse you, Admiral Lord Richard Howe. There were two Lord Howes. They were brothers. So Richard Howe was the brother of General William Howe. So it gets a little complicated when you figure out which Howe is being involved. In any case, they all came to this very handsome Dutch stone house. And well, we know the results. It didn't work, and there was no solution. So during the American Revolution, the area behind where City Hall is located today was the site of the Rhinelander Sugar House. The Rhinelanders were a very important family who brought sugar, Demerara sugar, to what is New York City, and this was the warehouse. And so during the Revolutionary War, the sugar house would be used as a prison. So what you see here is one of the windows that was used as part of the prison. They simply put bars in all of the windows of the sugar house. When that didn't work, they took this building here, which is the old brick church, and they turned that into a prison. Basically, the British were taking so many prisoners, they really started running out of places to put them. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So this is tucked right behind the David Dinkins Municipal Building, which is right behind New York City Hall. So here is where another part of that story, this is the Fort Greene Martyrs Monument. And I always refer to this as the most important forgotten Revolutionary War monument in the United States. If I said to you, there are 14,000 American Revolutionary soldiers buried in a park in Brooklyn, you might be surprised. Fort Greene Martyrs Monument is dedicated, and this is by the famous architect Stanford White, is dedicated to those people who were in the prison ships operated by the British because they'd run out of places to put people in prison. They would take iron chains and chain the what we would call the patriots to the decks of the ship, and every day they would call down and say, "Send up your dead," and anyone who died, they'd take the body and simply throw it into the waterfront by what would later become the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And when they started digging for the Brooklyn Navy Yard, they discovered all of these body parts. Now, it's hard to figure out the numbers because there's a leg here, there's a thigh here. That kind of thing is be very difficult to really ascertain how many were there. But a modest estimation would be 14,000 American patriots who died in the prison ships. So what happened is that the bones are all brought together by a man named Walter Whitman, who you probably know, the famous writer who had campaigned to have a beautiful monument designed by the chief architect of Central Park, Calvert Vaux. That never happened, but instead, Stanford White would build this monument. He never saw the monument. Unfortunately, he died before it was actually completed. Here is the inauguration of the first president of the United States in the very first Capitol building, which unfortunately I don't have a photograph of because we tore it down. So that's why this building is known as Federal Hall Memorial, is a memorial to the original Capitol building, which we tore down to be replaced by a bank. Now, that sort of sounds like the story of New York these days. In any case, George Washington is positioned here at the balcony that would have been at that level to take the oath of office. The Federal Hall, which, as I said, this is not Federal Hall, this is the building you'll see today. Federal Hall was the first Capitol building. It was designed by Pierre L'Enfant, who in his spare time would design this town down south called Washington, D.C. It was the home of the first Continental Congress. It was where the Bill of Rights was enacted. It was a very, very important building in the course of American history. Now, George Washington was not a Christian. It's one of those things that keeps getting bandied about, but he was not a Christian. He was a believer in a supreme being, which means that he could be a Mason. The interesting thing about Masons is they did not have a specific religious belief that you had to believe in, but you must believe in a spiritual figure, a God, a person who plays the role of God, which is why, for example, Jews can be Masons because being Jewish was perfectly acceptable. The only group that can't be Masons are Roman Catholics, and that's because it's against Roman Catholic rules for a Roman Catholic to be a Mason. Now, George Washington could not take an oath of office on a Christian Bible because he wasn't a Christian. So what he did is he borrowed the Bible of Robert Livingston, who is called the Chancellor of New York. Robert Livingston would be the father-in-law of this kid who would later come involved, who discovered that this man had invented a new magical boat called the steamboat. And when he was doing the campaign to raise money, it didn't work. He sunk the steamboat, but Robert Fulton was on that boat. And so his father-in-law said, "Kid, I have a proposition for you," which is why people mistakenly believe that Robert Fulton invented the steamboat. He didn't. It was somebody else's program. Now, this Bible, in all fairness, is not that different from a King James Bible, but it is officially not a Christian Bible, and it is located in the Masonic Lodge on 6th Avenue and 23rd Street in Chelsea. And George Washington, even though he wasn't a Christian, understood that showing up at church was good for politics. So here is George Washington's pew. and it was his personal box seat. People always would say, "Where's Martha's seat?" The answer is Martha did what most Christians did at that time of the country. She stayed home in bed. It wasn't a church-going nation. That really wasn't what this country was about. But in any case, here is the first known example of the presidential shield in the United States. The interior of the church would be redone by Pierre L'Enfant, the same man who would later design Washington, D.C. So here is the building itself. It's based on St. Martin's in the Fields in London. It's a very, very handsome building. And miraculously, it survived when the World Trade Center went down, even though literally it was across the street. And the reason as part of that is the way the World Trade Center was designed. It fell into itself as opposed to falling down and hitting the ground. So had it been designed differently after the World Trade Center disaster, people kept screaming, if it had only been designed better, or the architect knew what he was doing. I argue if it was built like nearly every other skyscraper on the planet Earth, it would have simply fallen down like a tent pole across all of Lower Manhattan, and there would be no Lower Manhattan. It would all have disappeared. So speaking of the World Trade Center, here's my absolute favorite World Trade Center memorial. This is designed by Masayuki Sono, who goes by the nickname Masa, and he designed it to be postcards. That's for the name of it. Notice that it's sort of bent in the wind to capture the wind, because when you write, you're on a trip or something, you send a postcard to a friend, and that's the postcard. This is your message to your friend. It is focused on absence. Not only the absence of your friend, it's the absence of the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center is gone, and that's what the monument is all about, absence. Here is the inside of the monument. As you go inside the monument, see how it looks like, it actually more like an envelope, and these slits are actually designed to capture light. So the light comes in and lights up these figures, and these are the profiles of all the people from Staten Island who died in the World Trade Center disaster. The interesting thing, like none of the other memorials, is that every family member was encouraged to become part of this memorial. And what the artist did with his assistant, they went from family to family to family to have them design these faces, the profiles of the people they loved. And you know how painful that must have been. Think of the stories. Oh, I remember him when he was 9. He just joined Little League. He was so proud of himself. You know, all the stories that would come out. But the stories were an important part of what the memorial is about. It allowed people to share their grief for the people they love. Masayuki Sono is I think, a tremendous, tremendous talent. So here is the World Trade Center today. So it's not the same site, but we do see here the Statue of Liberty raising her torch. And directly opposite in the city of Brooklyn is another statue raising her hand. This is the altar to liberty. And there it's a little hard to see in the distance. Statue of Liberty is out here in the harbor. This is the altar to liberty. This was a major site during the American Revolution. It's called Battle Hill for a very logical reason. And this is where George Washington would fight in the Battle of Long Island. Brooklyn is historically known as Long Island, but the usage of the term has been changed. Now, here is the altar. Here is the figure raising her hand, placing the wreath of peace on the altar. And just for curiosity, right around the corner, since this is a cemetery, it's Greenwood Cemetery, there is the gravesite of Leonard Bernstein. So there is Leonard Bernstein's grave. And it was interesting because this is more or less a Christian cemetery, although there are some Jews buried there. This has an Arab built around it, a boundary line, like you might find in a traditional Jewish neighborhood, an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. And Leonard Bernstein was raised as an Orthodox Jew. One of the things that puzzled people is that when he died, his tomb was marked with a popsicle stick. and on the popsicle stick taking, I don't even know if they still make them. Remember those plastic labeler machines called Dymo labels? They did a Dymo label that said L. Bernstein, taped it onto the popsicle stick and stuck it into the ground. And it would be there until the unveiling of the tombstone itself. So as all part of the act of mourning for Leonard Bernstein. Now, in Lower Manhattan, which historically was the focus point of the city of New York, one of the problems was as people started moving further away from where they were working, they couldn't go downstairs since most offices were in the same building as someone's residence. But as the residences moved further away and the offices moved further south, there was a need for providing lunch. And so Delmonico's would be the first French restaurant in the United States, and it would introduce people to that idea of lunch. These are really beautiful columns that are actually from Pompeii in Italy. So here is an old photograph of the building itself. But another old restaurant, which is near and dear to my heart, is Namwa Tea Parlor. It's what you would call a dim sum parlor. There you can see the old historic labels. And what's interesting, Wilson Tang, whose family has owned this restaurant for generations, left his position at Morgan Stanley just to make sure that the business continues. So you can Google your Amazon books and pick up your Namwa cookbook, which is regularly available. It's delightful fun. Now, speaking of restaurants, there's another very popular restaurant near Gramercy Park called Pete's Tavern. Pete's Tavern was built originally in 1864. It's changed names and whatever over the years. But between 1903 and 1907, O. Henry was a regular, and he would hang out there. Catherine Porter, O. Henry's real name was William Sidney Porter. He worked in a bank, and at the time, it was somewhat standard practice that if an employee of the bank needed money, they'd write an IOU and put it in the cash drawer and pay it back later. But William Sidney Porter's boss was a new supervisor, said, this has got to stop. And so he sent him to prison. And so William Sidney Porter, who was taking the money because his wife had cancer, was very concerned for his wife's condition. His wife died when he was in the Ohio State Penitentiary. So William Sidney Porter took the name of the prison for his pen name. So Ohio State Penitentiary. So O. Henry is a corruption of the Ohio State Penitentiary. Catherine Ann Porter, the famous writer, was related to him, and she referred to him as the family drunk. He would hang out here, and there is actually a banquette marked with where he was purportedly sitting when he wrote the famous Gift of the Magi story, which is one of the most popular stories. The thing about O. Henry stories is they were about ordinary people, not wealthy people, not rich people, just ordinary people. And it's a delightful, delightful tale of young love. It's a remarkable story. Also, another person who hung out at that bar restaurant is a man named Ludwig Bemelman. Ludwig Bemelman lived around the corner at the National Arts Club, and he would go there and hang out for lunch and maybe a beer with lunch, where he would write a book that you all know based on a woman who actually lived on Gramercy Park, although you wouldn't know it because in Madeline lives in Paris, not Gramercy Park, but it's actually based on an actual French woman who lived on Gramercy Park. Now, further up the street, because 23rd Street used to be the heart of the theater district in New York City, was Coster and Bial's, and there's still remnants of this. You'll still see the corner here, which was their pub for the men. It was a combination pub and theater. And here was a very grand building with Coster and Bial. Victor Herbert was the leader of the house orchestra. And just a little bit further north, Keene's Chop House is a beloved, beloved old place. It was built originally as a chop house, which is a 19th century steakhouse. And it was a men's club. And so when you came in, the tradition was you'd be given a Dutch meerschaum pipe, which you would then smoke, and they would label it. And when you come back, every time you would get your pipe back. They kept very strict records, but unfortunately in the 30s, they had a bad fire. So it got a little mixed up in the fire, but the pipes were hung from the ceiling. So it almost looked like you're inside Jonah's great fish. But here is Keene's Chop House, which is a theatrical chop house for the theater district. So these posters, these theater posters, are not reproductions. Those are original posters from original shows that were performed in by the people who used to hang out at Keene's Chop House. It's really quite wonderful. They have the largest collection of church warden pipes. Those are those Dutch meerschaum pipes. They have historic playbills, theater memorabilia. They have the Lily Langtry room, because Lily Langtry was, shall we say, gifted by the Prince of England to the men of New York. And frankly, Lily really didn't like sitting around in a parlor with other women. She wanted to be where the guys were. And she discovered that in New York, men's bars were off limits to women. So she got together with some of her male friends and she did the unthinkable. She sued the place she wanted to go to, and she won the lawsuit. And it's the first case in the United States where a woman was allowed to go into a gentleman's only premises. And the thing is, there is now a room in Keene's Chop House dedicated to Lily Langtry. One of my favorite things is they have a whole section for the Lambs Club. The Lambs were famous theater people from England, and the Lambs Club had carte de visite, which are calling cards of 19th century performers. These are more the side of tarot card. These are big cards. And very important, if you do visit, and I do insist that you do this, if you go there, go to the second floor, because right there at the top of the stairs is a collection of theatrical memorabilia from the performers who had come to Keene's, who were in Ford Theater when Abraham Lincoln was shot. So you'll actually see the program that Abraham Lincoln was carrying when he was killed. You'll see other details from that very prominent theater in Washington, D.C. So here was what brought it all about. Here's the Garrick Theater. Over here on the right-hand side is Lily Langtry in one of her famous roles, Viola in Twelfth Night. Further north, as we travel up the island, on Park Avenue, in what was built as the Hotel Vanderbilt, was this magnificent gentleman's bar that's now a steak restaurant called Wolfgang Steakhouse. And look at this beautiful, beautiful ceiling. This is known as the Della Robbia bar. It is dazzling. This photograph, actually, as wonderful as it is, doesn't do justice to that space. It's not the only space like that. And now right below City Hall in Lower Manhattan is the City Hall subway station. Years ago, I negotiated a way to get in through the MTA to bring a group in. And the woman said, well, there's nothing to look at. And she said, how long can you be there? I said, well, I can't promise. Well, an hour later, we managed to come back out. People were dazzled. Look at the stained glass ceiling, the leaded glass, these beautiful bronze memorial plaques here done by Gorham, the beautiful glazed tiles. And this is no longer used, it's usable, but the problem is, as you can see, they're very tight curves, and railroad trains or subway trains are now much, much longer today. And getting around that corner, they just squeal, and it's like, no, this is not a comfortable place. So you can actually visit it one of two ways, one of which is to, when you get to the Brooklyn Bridge station on the number 6 train, you just hide, you just duck down, wait till the train moves, and you'll actually go right through the City Hall station. The other thing is that the Subway Museum actually offers official guided tours of the subway station. on a fairly regular basis. So look for the New York Transit Museum website. One of my favorite images is by Ellen Driscoll, very talented artist. And art in public transportation is required by law. And it's often wonderful, sometimes, but oftentimes it's dazzling. And Ellen Driscoll was playing with the fact that the starry, starry skies of Grand Central Terminal would entice people to focus on stars. So here she's looking at Chinese views of the world. Look at this beautiful, this is all done with ceramic tile, and notice how it looks almost like a newspaper image. Here is a wonderful ceramic mural done by the beloved artist Nancy Sparrow, and it's called Artemis, Acrobats, Divas, and Dancers. And this is to celebrate the joys of Lincoln Center. Here is a recent work. This was recently added to the new Second Avenue subway by Vic Muniz, who is a Brazilian artist. It's called Perfect Strangers. There's actually a whole series of different kinds of images that he did, but here is an image that many New Yorkers can associate with as this man's briefcase goes flying and all of his papers go flying elsewhere, meant to sort of make you laugh a little, make you chuckle. And this is a delightful piece by Faith Ringgold, who sadly is no longer with us. She recently died. Faith Ringgold was an artist when everyone was doing modernism. She decided to go back into her family tradition and to make quilts. And so she became famous for her quilts. These are Harlem heroes and heroines flying home. The belief was that when you die in an African culture, you fly over the water. You must be near the water. That's why the earliest African communities in Manhattan were down by Collect Pond, because you wanted to pass over the water into your next life. So we're looking at some of the great heroes. Here is the Apollo Theater, and you can see here is Lady Day here. There are various performers here. And this is what she became famous for. This is a quilt that she did called Tar Beach. For those who are not familiar, since roofs in New York are covered with tar, and in a tenement building, where else do you go when it's a hot summer's day but onto the roof? The roof is called Tar Beach. And so you see these little figures here, and these are family members of Faith Ringgold. Done in her story is about 1939, and she dreams that she and her friends can fly over the city. So here is she uses the name Cassie Louise Lightfoot, but it's really Miss Ringgold herself. This is a very beautiful quilt. It's now in the Philadelphia Museum. It's well worth a visit. She's beloved for these quilts. Now, speaking of beloved, here is the Catskill Mountains in Manhattan. This is a park called Teardrop Park, right down near the bottom tip of the island, but it's very consciously playing on the imagery that any of your family members who might have gone to the Jewish Catskills would have seen when they went to the Catskills. So it was to capture that wonderful romantic moment of being in the mountains. This is one of my absolute favorite gardens. This is the Huamei Bird Garden. The Huamei Bird Garden is a garden for men who, in the Chinese community, collect birds. And you'll see these bird cages in the Chinese shops, and you may think, oh, they're cute, but they're actually, they're prestige symbols. They're prestige symbols, as are the birds. And the birds need fresh air. And so every day the men will bring the birds out to air. The birds will sing, they'll have a good time, and the men will talk. And it's a very strong cultural link for the community. And this is located just between Forsyth and Christie on Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park, which is just south of Delancey. So this is the Lower East Side as it bumps into Chinatown. And not Chinatown at all. This is a Japanese garden in the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens. Brooklyn, they speak English. In the Bronx, they speak British. So the Botanic Garden in Brooklyn, Botanical Garden in the Bronx. Botanical is a British phrase, not an American phrase. But the Japanese garden was actually designed by the chief gardener to the court of Japan. So this is an authentic Japanese garden. Here is the torii gate to protect from evil spirits. The idea is that the evil spirits would have to go under the gate, which is very difficult for them to do in order to enter into this magical world. It's a delightful, delightful garden in the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens. And this is a Chinese garden in Staten Island, and we'll see the actual stone. The stones are alternate white and black. The stones are often referred to as the bones of the earth. This is a garden for contemplation. There are poems all throughout the garden and places to sit to contemplate the nature of the poetry. It's a delightful garden. And totally unrelated to those, and I think one of the most magical places in New York City is that what you may know is that New York City has the largest wildlife complex wildlife refuge in the United States within city limits, and it's 18,000 acres of wildlife refuge. It's pretty amazing, called Jamaica Bay, and you'll see the various birds. What I love are these cacti, which would look perfectly at home, and they're actually technically a succulent. They look perfectly at home in Santa Fe. One hardly thinks of it as a New York, but this is a New York native plant. And you'll see birds. One of my favorite things is that they'll actually have a nighttime viewing of the horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs mate only in the dark at night, so you'll have to come and visit the crabs. It's a sort of a goofy evening, but lots of fun to experience. Now, gardens are beloved by New Yorkers, and one of the most beloved gardens is the High Line. The High Line is the former elevated train where a young kid who got the nickname Billy the Kid would learn to ride a horse. Historically, the trains were right in the center on the street, and the trains would come down, and if the kids were playing on the street, the kids would not survive. So young men used to ride in front of the trains on horseback with a lantern to signal to the kids to get out of the way because a train was coming. And Billy the Kid, like many cowboys, was a native New Yorker. I always point out, very few cowboys were born in Tombstone territory. They were born in such exotic Western places as Portland, Maine, or Boston, or Baltimore, and they would travel out west. The design for the gardens are by a famous Dutch horticulturist, Piet Oudolf, and I always describe it as God was going through the garden with bundles of plants and tripped, because it's designed to look like everything is natural. This is all on the site of the original railroad tracks. Now, a newest garden in the city of New York is Little Island, which is Pier 55. And if the numbers of the piers confuse you, don't worry, they confuse everybody. Just so you know, it's near West 13th Street along the Hudson River. And look at this garden, these series of pods which are constructed to create a garden for theatrical performing space, all in above the Hudson River. A very different garden uses the gates of the former Vanderbilt mansion. This is when Gloria Vanderbilt went home to her family house. This was the gate the carriage would have gone through. It was custom made for the Vanderbilt family in Paris, and you can actually see the mark of the Parisian founder. And these are the conservatory gardens. This garden we're looking directly at are the Italian gardens. Everything is done in shades of green, different colors of green. It's cool, it's refreshing. There's also a French garden and an American garden using an English design, and we'll show you that in 1 second. Here is the Secret Garden, who gets its name from that beloved children's book. And look at that wonderful lily part. This is one of my favorite places. You may not know, but the average number of volunteer gardeners in Central Park are at about 10,000 volunteers come to work in the gardens. It's a real privilege to be able to work in the gardens. And how do you handle 10,000 volunteers? What they do is they give people a rectangular piece, basically a blueprint for how the plants are to be planted in the park. and everyone gets one of these little pieces, and together they make a big puzzle that looks mysteriously like a beautiful garden. So it's really quite a fascinating thing to see all of these volunteer gardeners come out and take care of their little piece of Central Park. And on Central Park is this very handsome building designed by the great-grandson of Stanford White. This is the Dana Discovery Center. This is up at the northern reach of the park, at the beginning of what used to be Jewish Harlem. And beloved to many, many people, and I guarantee you, beloved to the children. And here's the giveaway. Here's Balto the dog made of bronze, and look how shiny he is. That's from all the kids who had to sit on Balto and slipped off, and it polishes the bronze. And I love seeing the shiny bronze. It tells you how much he's loved. Balto, for those who don't know, is a very popular children's book, but there was a real dog. It was a sled dog who in 1925, when they needed to get antitoxin to Nome, Alaska, the sled dog, led his team through temperatures as low as 50 degrees below zero. They made the trip in 5 days. People watched it all across in the newspapers and the radio. He became an international subject. And the thing is, it was a group of artists that would get together and hire Frederick Ruckstuhl to create this as the artist gift to the people of New York City. And here is something in Central Park that is typical of the chief architect of Central Park was Calvert Vaux. When Central Park was built, Frederick Law Olmsted had only created one garden in his entire life. So Calvert Vaux was trained as an architect and as a landscape architect, and he would create these wonderful little fantasy buildings. And this is a dairy. And later, Nathan Strauss, one of the owners of Abraham and Strauss, would become a great benefactor, and he created this program to provide pasteurized milk to the children of the Lower East Side and to the children of the poor of New York City. He had many benefactions, but one he's very famous for. And so this was called the dairy because this is where fresh milk would be given to kids, usually for free. Nathan Strauss would go off to Palestine and would be taken by the needs of the people of Palestine. And so it became a major benefactor of Palestine, and then later Israel as Palestine, which is a Roman name, would become. To give you a sense of how important Nathan Strauss was, if you've ever been to Israel, go to the town of Netanya and realize Netanya is named for Nathan Strauss. And here is Frederick Law Olmsted's property. This is the only garden he ever did in his life before Central Park. And the house is still there. It was saved by a high school teacher in Staten Island who didn't have much money, but he wanted to make sure the house didn't get destroyed. And he gave it to the Parks Department upon his death. So that's what the Beale is of Olmsted, Beale, the Beale family. But in any case, it was on Staten Island that Frederick Law Olmsted would be introduced to Calvert Vaux by the very famous architect Richard Morris Hunt. Staten Island was once a major, major place for intellectuals of the United States. Now, people say, so where do you live? This is where I live. We live right down the street from Wave Hill, which was a series of mansions and this very lovely garden overlooking the Hudson. In the Wave Hill house, some of the residents include a young Teddy Roosevelt. It's where Mark Twain lived. Arturo Toscanini lived there. I mean, it's an amazing collection of historical people, but it's right over the Hudson River. Not far from there in Manhattan on the Upper West Side is this very, very unusual museum called the Nicholas Roerich Museum. And the Nicholas Roerich Museum is a townhouse. So this gives you a sense of what a typical New York townhouse looked like. With his own paintings, he would create, for example, the Rite of Spring paintings. He did numerous things. But what's interesting is, so for those of you who are Santa Fe folks, there is a group in Santa Fe that was called the Cinco Pintores, the five painters, and it was the time when everyone had to have a manifesto. And so Nicholas Roersch created the manifesto for the group of artists that lived in Santa Fe, that group of five artists who were all different kinds of artists. But their point was, if we sold it, there were no dealers at the time, so they wanted to market themselves as a team. And so that was the function. Now, Roersch also would create the Roersch Pact, and the Roersch Pact is an agreement that all cultural treasures belong to all people. No one country owns cultural treasures. They belong to everyone. If there is ever a time of strife, it is the obligation of anyone who signs the contract to protect all of the artworks, the cultural treasures. Sadly, although the United States signed that contract, when the Iraq Museum was attacked, this country did absolutely nothing, and all of the members of the National Arts Commission resigned, right? All at the same time, because the federal government failed to fulfill its obligation. If you haven't been to this house, I would recommend make it a point. It's whatever you want to contribute. There's no official charge. Absolutely delightful. A little further north is the Hispanic Society, which is considered to be the finest. Hispanic, when I say Hispanic, that means Spain, Portugal, South and Central America, any place where Spanish is a common language. And also, as I said, Portugal, because of the shared Iberian Peninsula connection. This was founded by Mr. Huntington, who built 36 museums in his lifetime. This man, the joke was, if he puts his foot down, a museum pops up. But he was a major aficionado of things Spanish. And so this is his own personal art collection. The Impressionist Spanish artist Sorolla would be commissioned to do these bigger than life paintings of Spain. This is the most famous painting here. This is the famous painting by Goya of the Duchess of Alba. What you can't see in the photograph, because it's hard to do it, is that if you look in the sand, the sign says solo Goya, as if the Duchess of Alba is saying only Goya. Nobody quite knows what that means, but it's a magical, magical museum. So going to Columbia University is a great place to think. So hence this sculpture called The Thinker, the Penseur, which was created by Auguste Rodin. This was commissioned in 1930 by the then president, Nicholas Murray Butler, from the Musée Rodin. So this is an original Rodin sculpture here. And right around the corner is this great building, which is so important. There's actually a postage stamp where this is the Abiel Abbott Lowe Library at Columbia. And right here is a statue that I'm going to show you a close-up, because tradition has it that this is the figure of Minerva, or Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And she's also known at Columbia as Alma Mater, our mother of our heart. So if you look at her, she has a staff with mysteriously what looks like the crown of King George III of England. Columbia pretends to have been King's College, and it's a long story, but it never was King's College. It's totally made up. But in any case, the best way to prove your cases is simply show evidence. And so their evidence is they use the crown all the time. So here is Minerva, but it's said that you cannot graduate from Columbia until you solve the mystery question, and that is find the owl. The owl is a symbol of wisdom and is a symbol of Minerva. And I'm going to give you a hint. If you see where my cursor is, the owl is hiding in there. So let's go over here, and we can see that owl peeking through the skirt. If any of you've ever been 3 or 4 years old and hid in your mother's skirts, that's exactly what the owl is doing. We can see the owl is hiding in there. And so if you identify the owl, you get to graduate from Columbia. So another statue is that very beloved writer, Washington Irving. Washington Irving was at one time the ambassador to Spain and actually lived in the Alhambra, which is not a bad place to live. He would write a book called Tales of the Alhambra, but it was just, I think, calling Tales from My Living Room. This is the last surviving brownstone house on Lower Fifth Avenue near Washington Square, and it's home of the Salmagundi Club. And Salmagundi gets its name from Washington Irving, who do this magazine called the Salmagundi Papers. And for those who don't know, if you've ever been to one of those reproduction 18th century, villages, they'll often have in their restaurants, they'll have salmagundi, which is a meat salad, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You might call it slumgullion. But in any case, the Salmagundi Arts Club is one of the oldest art clubs in the United States. These are palettes of many famous artists in their collection. It's a fascinating place to visit. But a different artist is Josef Albers. Josef Albers graduated taught at the Bauhaus in Germany. And this was designed for the Pan Am building. But when the Pan Am building was taken over by MetLife, MetLife sent it to Cleveland to put it into a dump. This has been recreated by the building's owners. And right nearby, by Grand Central, is the entrance to the Gray Bar building, and little rats climbing up the rats. See the little rats? The rats are a symbol of transportation. If you look carefully, you'll see little rat faces, little rat paws, little ears. And the idea, of course, is that rats were part of sea travel, and is right near the Daily Planet for Superman. And if you look on the walls, this is where Jimmy Olsen used to hang out. This is where all of the newspaper reporters go. And these are actual cartoons by some of the most famous cartoonists in the history of the United States. The deal was, we'll give you food and drink if you'll decorate our walls, which is not a bad contract. So here's your assignment, should you choose to accept it. I'd like you to go to Simon & Schuster building in Rockefeller Center at 6th Avenue and 49th Street. I would like you to enter into the lobby of the building and then look carefully for a column that's near the front desk, in which you will find a very tiny disc-shaped aperture, a window. And the disc is about the size of this quarter, so it's tiny. You're looking for something very small. And there's a name here. Let's see if we can read the name. It's this guy right here. This is John D. Rockefeller. That is the last rivet in Rockefeller Center. And that the signature is to tell you who put it there. So here, Rockefeller Center is the largest collection of public art on the planet Earth. And it was put together by two women, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and her very important art dealer, the first Jewish woman art dealer in America. She was not from a rich family. She was a poor working class Jewish woman who invented all sorts of things that would transform the art world today. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller was her major client, and so she would say, let's get this artist. So the artworks, and there are a tremendous number of artworks in Rockefeller Center, were all the mutual agreement of those two women. So here we can see by Dean Cornwell, is considered the dean of American illustrators, murals on 54th Street. Here we can see Sir Walter Raleigh coming into America. This was done for William Randolph Hearst, was noted for not paying bills on time. And frankly, Cornwell got a little bit upset. So he always included little naughty bits in the painting. And the basic deal was, until you pay me the bill, you're going to keep the naughty bits. Well, ultimately, some of the money was paid, some of the money wasn't. So there's still some naughty bits left. And so if you ever visit the hotel there on 54th Street, the old Warwick Hotel, just lean on any staff member. I guarantee you they're happy to show you where the naughty bits are in that. But it's actually a wonderful mural. This is at the King Cole Bar on 55th Street at the St. Regis Hotel. This is actually a piece of a much larger mural, but this was a painting by Maxfield Parrish, who was always a bit of a card. And one of his friends said, I bet you can't paint a painting of someone passing gas and get away with it. Well, This is a painting of someone passing gas. We'll let you figure out what the name is, the Royal F.A. Well, you can figure that out. Anyway, if you look at King Cole, he's got this very big smile on his face. And here are his crew all sort of looking a little weird. And here are his soldiers with their hands to their face, trying to get rid of the awful smell. It was done for a men's bar, so it's meant to be a little bit off color. So here we see a sidewalk by Alexander Calder on 78th and 79th Street, right next door. This is a very important destination, Maison du Chocolat. So look for Maison du Chocolat and then go look at the Calder sidewalk, which is right next door. Very beautifully done. It's signed and dated, which is pretty impressive for a sidewalk. This is one of my favorite places many people have never heard of. Lewis Latimer was the only African-American who worked for Thomas Edison, and he invented the carbon filament for light bulbs. There were hundreds of things they tried. Thomas Edison always figured that mistakes were a blessing from God, and then he kept trying and trying. But it would be Lewis Latimer, whose parents had been runaway slaves. They'd come up to Boston. He taught himself how to be an engineer and became quite successful. And this is his house in Flushing, Queens. I once was there with one of their coordinators who asked a group of kids that was with her, what would the world be like without Lewis Latimer? And she said, dark, very dark. Here's another Queens-based thing. This, of course, is Chester Carlson, who was a physics graduate. His job was boring, as doing patent work in Manhattan. He was not happily married. He was living with his in-laws in Jackson Heights and said, I can't deal with this. So he started hanging out in the New York Public Library because he had these ideas about the document copying machine. He'd read a book called Photoelectric Phenomena and discovered Einstein's paper in the New York Public Library on the photoelectric effect that had been published 30 years before that. And then Carlson came from that, out of that, and demonstrated his first copy machine in Astoria, Queens in 1938. The name of the company you may recognize is Xerox. So born in the New York Public Library. Right up the street from the library on 52nd Street is the guest house built for the Rockefeller family for Museum of Modern Art. This was so that if guests came to the Museum of Modern Art, they could stay at this Philip Johnson designed house. This is one of those curious Philip Johnson designs where the living space and the bathroom space are separate. You have to go outside. I can't imagine doing that in the middle of a New York winter, but here, just around the corner, is Paley Park, built on the site of the former Stork Club. And this is a lovely, lovely park that's operated by the Paley family. They come personally every week to inspect the park, make sure it's being taken care of, that the food is as good as they want it to be, all of those good things. It's a delightful place. On the Upper West Side, there was a property that was purchased, but because the 20s were going into the 30s and there was a little uneasiness about the financial stability, they decided to build what are called taxpayer buildings, little tiny buildings that would pay the taxes. And then when their taxes are done and the climate has changed, they can tear them down and build other buildings on the site. Well, they never built the other buildings. And they built these, which are modeled after a Broadway show called Pomander Walk, hence the name Pomander Walk. This is tucked away between 94th and 95th Street. It's up and out of view, but it's this magical world right in the middle of the Upper West Side. And another magical world on 49th Street near the Waldorf Astoria. This was Amster Yard, an old coach house on the road that used to lead out of Manhattan. It was taken over by the famous interior designer, James Amster. Jackie Kennedy would take classes here. Norman Norell, the fashion designer, had a studio there. Billy Baldwin, it would become a major destination. Now, here is the Alexander Hamilton Grange in Harlem. And Alexander Hamilton's farm was named the Grange after the home of the Marquis de Lafayette. But the problem is they needed to move it. So in order to move it, they had to lift it up, move it down the street. And it's now located around the corner in a park designed by Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted. This has now become a major, major destination because of the Broadway show Hamilton, which means that every 14-year-old knows more about American history than most adults. And it's quite amazing. This Broadway show has been very, very carefully researched. It's very accurate. And Lin-Manuel Miranda is, in my estimation, one of the great people. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. In Harlem is the Sylvan Terrace next to the Morris Jumel Mansion. The Morris Jumel Mansion, when it was still the Roger Morris House, was where George Washington lived during the Battle of Harlem Heights. He didn't just sleep here, he lived there. And here is the house itself, which is one of the oldest houses in New York City, and certainly one of the oldest houses in Manhattan. It was built as a luxury country house way out in the country by Mary Livingston and her husband. Mary Livingston's father it wasn't a very generous gift. He only gave her about 500 acres of Manhattan real estate for her wedding present. Everything in that house was made right on the property itself. Here is an interior of the room. It's a different time and place. It's an older image from a postcard. Here is George Washington, and the Battle of Harlem Heights is today where Columbia University. Columbia, as I said, is located in Harlem. They would just rather you didn't know that. So they call it Morningside Heights. Here is the dining room where all of the major people in the early United States government would come to meet with Eliza Jumel in her dining room. It's really quite lovely. And Eliza Jumel lived here with her husband, Aaron Burr. Eliza Jumel had married a very wealthy French wine merchant who died under mysterious circumstances and left all of his money to her. She was fabulously rich. Aaron Burr wanted money. She wanted the social cachet, but it didn't last for very long. They were married for fewer than 5 months. And then Aaron Burr would move to Staten Island to Port Richmond, which was the town on the way to Philadelphia, where he would die. And for a very long time, you could go to the St. James Hotel and ask for Burr's room. And they, honest to God, had a sign over the bed saying, Aaron Burr died here. Now, right across the street from the Morris Jumel Mansion is another house that is very important. There was a very revered Broadway performer and social activist who lived in the house. The windows of his second floor study provided a tremendously expansive view of Morris Jumel Mansion. And in his autobiography called Here I Stand, that famous Broadway performer would write, I am an American. From my window, I gaze out upon a scene that reminds me of how deep going are the roots of my people in this land. Across the street, carefully preserved as an historic shrine, is a colonial mansion that served as a headquarters for General George Washington in 1776. Among those who came to offer help in that desperate hour was my great-great-grandfather. His name was Cyrus Bustill, who was born a slave in New Jersey and had managed to purchase his freedom. He became a baker, and it is recorded that George Washington thanked him for supplying bread to the starving Revolutionary Army. The name of that Broadway performer is Paul Robeson, and that's Paul Robeson's house. And it was this room right here through which you could look directly into the Jumel Mansion where George Washington once lived. The house is now owned by the 15-time Grammy Award winner Alicia Keys, and she bought it as a place for her mother. It's really quite I have some wonderful stories, but I have to keep going. And here is the home of James Bailey of Barnum and Bailey Circus. Magical, magical house. For many years, it was a funeral home. Very beautiful house. It was so well loved that if you go up to Cortland, New York, you could see the flip version of the same house. Someone in the Finger Lakes district of upstate New York said, that's the house I wanted. So he approached the architect and said, build me one of those. In the Bronx is the Bartow Pell Mansion, and this is a magical country house operated by the American Garden Society of America, so the grounds are quite beautiful. Edgar Allan Poe's house, the cottage in which he lived while he wrote The Bells. The bells are the bells of Fordham University nearby, which was then called St. John's College. And the bells, bells, bells. It's also where he wrote the love poem to his wife who had died. And the name of the poem is Annabel Lee. And this is where it's the house is an historic treasure and is saved. And just for fun, not too far from there is a little island called City Island that was, in theory, going to be the center of New York, a very wonderful maritime island. And this is a house from Sears Roebuck. This was ordered from a catalog and delivered in City Island to be constructed, much like IKEA furniture or Tinker Toys. Here in Staten Island is an oyster mansion. The oysters from Staten Island were as large as dinner plates and will be shipped around the world. And this is how the first free Black community came to New York State, and they would work in the oyster farms and then would live right behind it. This mansion is now owned by the city of New York. It's the only mansion I know of within the city limits that has its own horse farm. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful house. I know we're bouncing all over, but please stay with me. On 4th Street is the house that was the Seabury Treadwell house. Miss Treadwell's family died. She inherited the house. The money of New York had moved further uptown, and she would become the character that you know from the movie The Heiress or from the famous novel by Henry James, who grew up nearby, called Washington Square. The very beautiful house. Look inside and see the original furnishings and this beautiful double parlor, original Greek Revival interior is absolutely stunning. Here's a house done by the same man who would be St. Patrick's Cathedral. He would restore an old Dutch building, and it was the home of Alice Austin, who lived here for many years with her partner. Apologize, let's go backwards. Who lived here with her partner, Alice Tate. And this house has been restored. It's absolutely magical. It's right on the New York Harbor. You overlook the Verrazano Bridge. This is a little Irish shanty house that would be moved when the Roman Catholic Church bought the property to turn it into a nursing home. The house would be put onto a trailer to a piece of real estate in Greenwich Village, where the house would be moved here. This was the home of the famous children's book writer Margaret Wise Brown. There is the little cottage. It's really quite fascinating. She wrote a book called Hidden House, and it was a little house in the middle of a big city, and nobody knew it was there. It had been there for years and years, for over 100 years, forgotten. And there it stood in a hidden garden in the middle of a big block of skyscrapers. And there is Margaret Wise Brown with her beloved dog, who would appear in some of her children's stories. Many of you know her from probably her most beloved book, Good Night Moon. Park Avenue by the Hotel Waldorf Astoria originally had yellow brick. It was the prototype for L. Frank Baum's Yellow Brick Road. The Yellow Brick Road was Park Avenue. But here is the interior of the church across the street, done by a very talented woman named Hildreth Mayer, who designed all the mosaics and the stained glass. Spectacular interior. Here is another spectacular interior in a building, ironically, by Philip Johnson. This was a gift of Hagop Kevorkian, and this is part of a 19th century house from Damascus. The famous Woolworth Tower with these wonderful characters. There's Frank Woolworth counting his nickels and dimes. A spectacular building that's being converted to apartments. This is the Fuller Building. The original Fuller Building was the Flatiron Building, but nobody ever called it that. So he built another Fuller Building here. This is by Eli Nodelman, an artist, a Jewish artist who lived in Riverdale, right near Wave Hill. So we're coming close to the end. Here is a cathedral to travel in Lower Manhattan. Look at that starry, that beautiful ceiling. This is by the same artist with the interiors of Radio City Music Hall, Paul Winter. Here we can see the, Ezra Winter rather. Here we can see the Chrysler Building, but how many of you knew the Chrysler Building has little automobiles going around and around and around the building? This is the hood ornament from a 1929 Chrysler. It's a celebration of the automobile. But on 10th Street and 2nd Avenue is the celebration of what used to be the largest Yiddish theater neighborhood in America. Here is a plaque to Abraham Goldfaden. Oh, Goldfaden would be the founder of Yiddish theater in America. And here is Kaladoth Sheshrun, which is the Elder Street Synagogue with its beautiful stained glass window by Kiki Smith. Look at those interiors. This has all been restored. The Bialystoker Synagogue on the Lower East Side of the Polish Jews from the town of Bialystok. And many people will use the phrase Mazel Tov, but how many people actually know what it means? Mazel means horoscope. Even though it says in the Bible you shouldn't be messing with horoscopes, it is part of virtually every Eastern European Jewish synagogue. So here are some of the features, but you couldn't do living creatures who were people. And so here you see the twins here. Here you can see our favorite thing. This is Cancer the lobster. Because you're in Eastern Europe, who's ever seen a lobster? Who's ever seen rather a crab? But it's a beautiful interior, and in that is a memorial yahrzeit plaque for Benjamin Siegel. You may know him better as Bugsy Siegel. Oh, yeah. So now for our finale, 2 exciting additions to New York City's Nooks and Crannies just for you. On March 15th, 2021, the Brooklyn Municipal Building on Joralemon Street was renamed the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Municipal Building. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is from Flatbush in Brooklyn. 2 artists named Adrian Wilson and Matt Duncan collaborated to take what was the 50th Street subway station, and they renamed the station Ruth Street, which I think is pretty nifty. I like that. And here on March 12th, 2021, there was a new installation of a bronze sculpture of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on display. A really quite wonderful thing. So what makes New York so very special? New York City is a lifetime love affair. Toda rabah. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed everything.
Justin, thank you so much. Some of you may have heard Justin's previous iteration of Nooks and Crannies, which was held at Temple Beth Shalom here in Santa Fe at least 5-7 years ago. And clearly, you know, you've created and added so many more interesting and fun things to this presentation. So we want to take a few questions and comments. Let me see if I can get to the chat. Naomi, you have to help me out here. I've lost the chat box. You're muted, Naomi.
I do have the chat box up, and
okay.
There's no questions so far. There are a lot of accolades. Great presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Another illuminating talk. Are there any questions that anybody wants to put in the chat box? I know it's getting late where some of you are located, so.
Yeah.
Do you still lead tours is one of the questions. And
I'm beginning to lead tours once again. I'm not doing a lot of them. I've had medical issues, but I'm now moving past that. So I've conducted a few tours recently, and I've been doing a fair number of Zoom talks.
Justin's very modest. This is his second talk today. So how do we get in touch with you is another question.
Okay. My email is my first initial, my last name, and the word tours. So it's JFERATETOURS@gmail.com.
Another question, the Old Dutch Farmhouse, is the Old Dutch Farmhouse in Brooklyn off Kings Highway?
I once actually gave a tour of Dutch farmhouses in Brooklyn. There are about 25 surviving Dutch farmhouses. And it was funny because it was, shall we say, a group on a very tight budget. So I hired a school bus. Everyone thinks school buses are wonderful. Just you have those fond memories of riding a school bus, and then you sit in one and go, there's no springs here. This is like, and there's no bathroom. Anyway, so on the school bus trekking around, but the real prize was that the school bus driver was going through his daily route. It's a route he drove every day. And all during the tour, he kept saying, I didn't know that was there. That's a Dutch house. I never, and the thing is, they're tucked in places you wouldn't necessarily know them. There are some really grand Dutch houses, and there's some that are much smaller, much more humble. And several of the Dutch houses are located in the Brooklyn Museum. So you're going to, because the Brooklyn Museum is one of the first museums in the country to collect buildings. And so they installed buildings and rooms into the Brooklyn Museum. So you can see the Jan Martens Skenk house, and then a later Skenk house again in the museum.
Is there a book about these nooks and crannies?
That's a good question. Not about these are sort of my invention, but there is send me an email and I'll track down the book. There's a book that was published a number of years ago that is about little places you might not know about in New York City. And it's written by an aficionado. And I love books written by aficionados because they carry their passion with them. And it's a fun book. So I'll look if I can find that book, and then I'll be happy to send you the name and the contact information.
Another compliment. This has been so wonderful. Will there be a way to see this tour again? It was recorded, and so it will be sent out to those who registered for the program this evening. So yes.
Yeah, it will probably take about a week or so, but information will be sent out. I did find the chat box.
Oh, good.
Here's a comment. McCorsley's Tavern was started in 1854. And then I lost the last part of that.
Keene was in the 1880s, it says.
Ah, right. I see. Yeah, thank you. And then from someone else, yay, I miss New York, my hometown. So New York, New York.
There was a fellow who was a collector of historic bars, and McSorley's has long claimed to be the oldest bar in New York, but it was absolutely confirmed that the Brooklyn bar down by the Brooklyn Bridge bar, is actually older than McSorley's. But when it comes to that kind of thing, it's like, okay, it was under a different owner, it moved, that kind of thing. But it's one of the classic bars. McSorley's historically had no women's room, which made it a problem when women were allowed to go to the bar. And so they actually had a protest rally to protest McSorley's, and they were forced to install women's restrooms. Drinking a lot of beer and not having to go to the bathroom is a real issue. So anyway, it's a wonderful treasure. Abraham Lincoln even had a drink at McSorley's pub.
Yeah. Well, again, Justin, thank you so much. Naomi, do you have some wrap-up comments you'd like to add and some information about future programs?
Well, I just throw in a silly thing for you, which is that Louis and I used to have a place in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where every name that you would swear is Jewish in New York isn't Jewish in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And it started feeling like I'd gone into a foreign country. And one day Louis was at the chiropractor, and I said, well, let me just go across the street to this store. And I went into this household goods shop, and this woman came up to me and said, so what can't you live without? So that's my question to all of you. What can't you live without? Anyway, I should let Naomi take the stage. There are things to talk about.
Well, I want to add my thanks to the echoes of thanks here. So 2 upcoming programs of which we want to make you aware. One is the annual meeting of the Society is going to take place on Sunday, June
9th.
9th. I keep wanting to make it the 6th, which is not a Sunday. 9th at the Jewish Community Center in Albuquerque. It will begin at 1 p.m. and at 2 p.m. our keynote speaker, Ron Hart, will present, and it should be very interesting. And he will speak about Colombia, the country, and Jewish life and history. So that is taking place, and we encourage everybody to attend. That will be in person. The next event, which we're very excited about, will be the annual conference. That will be October 25th through 27th in Las Vegas, New Mexico at Highlands University. And we've also got an exciting program about renewal and Jewish life in New Mexico and Southern Colorado. So we invite everyone to check our webpage for information, and thank everyone for participating this evening.
Thank you so much. And for those who celebrate Passover, we hope you have a good celebration. And thank you and good night.
And thank you again, Justin.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.